Hello, everybody, and welcome to today's lesson on analyzing conditional statements. Our objectives for today will be we will be able to identify the conditional, converse, inverse, and contrapositive of a conditional statement, and we will be able to write them in symbolic form. We will also use the law of the contrapositive to determine the truth value of a statement. A conditional statement is a logical statement that has two parts: the hypothesis or premise, which usually comes at the beginning of the statement, and a conclusion. The conclusion usually comes at the end of the statement. A conditional statement can be written in if-then form, but it isn't always, and we will see that later too. We can use symbolic notation to write a conditional statement, and usually we use the letters of the alphabet, for example P, and followed by an arrow, and then another letter. This reads P, then Q, and we use the letters of the alphabet in the alphabetical order. We use symbolic notation to simplify things. We don't have to write out the entire conditional statement with all the words. We can just abbreviate by using letters for the hypotheses and the conclusions. As I said before, we use the letters of the alphabet in alphabetical order. In other words, the letter that we use to indicate the hypothesis comes before the letter that we use to indicate the conclusion. Very frequently we use P for the hypothesis or premise and Q for the conclusion, but we can use other letters as well. And the arrow we use to indicate the direction, in other words, which part, in this case the hypothesis, is the condition for the conclusion and leads to the conclusion. So let's look at a couple of examples. All right, these are examples. Identify the hypothesis, the premise, and the conclusion of each statement. Let's look at that first statement. If the weather is warm, then we should go swimming. Followed by the word if comes our hypothesis. This is our hypothesis. The weather is warm. And following the word then, we have our conclusion. We should go swimming. Let's look at that next example. And as I said before, not every conditional statement is written in if-then form. This next one says all Smart Snow students are mavericks. So we need to figure out first what's the hypothesis and what's the conclusion. In this case, the hypothesis is the student is from Smart's Mill. And the conclusion that follows from that is that the student is a maverick. In the next two examples, we are going to practice rewriting a conditional statement in if-then form. And then we're going to use symbolic notation to identify the hypothesis and the conclusion. Let's look at our first example. Geometry students always pass the SOL. The hypothesis here is if a student takes geometry, and the conclusion is, then he or she will pass the SOL. So again, we're going to mark our hypothesis. A student takes the geometry, and let's use the letter A for our hypothesis this time. And the conclusion is he or she will pass the SOL. For our conclusion, we're going to use the next letter in the alphabet. That's the letter B. And in symbolic form, we can now write our conditional statement A, arrow, B. Our next example makes things a little easier for us. Today is Monday if yesterday was Sunday. The if in the sentence, even though it's not at the beginning of the sentence, already indicates to us this must be our hypothesis. So if yesterday was Sunday is our hypothesis. And then today is Monday is our conclusion. So the if and the then technically aren't really part of hypothesis and conclusion. They're just indicating that the hypothesis and the conclusion will follow. That's why I haven't circled them either. Our hypothesis yesterday was Sunday. We're gonna this time indicate with the letter C. And the conclusion today is Monday. We indicate by the letter D. And in symbolic notation, we will now write C leads to D, C arrow D, and that's that. Now, with respect to hypothesis and conclusion and the examples that we just looked at, I want you to think about one thing. Very often, not always, but it can be a good indication to think about which of the two things happened first. If sometimes you are in trouble trying to figure out which one is the hypothesis, look at your sentence and think about which part happens first, and that can be and very often is the hypothesis. Alright, now go ahead and watch the next video that will have the second part of today's lesson on it.